My name is Tomás Moximoin. I'm a writer. I live in Catalonia, which is a part of the Spanish state. My involvement with kind of Cuba is out of interest concerning the sort of politics of Cuba, but also having to do with the involvement of an Irishman, James J. O'Kelly, in Cuban history, basically in the first phase of the Cuban liberation struggle. He visited Cuba in 1873 in order to report on that struggle. Basically, I went to Cuba at the invitation of the Writers and Artists Union of Cuba in order to follow in his footsteps and research, do a little bit of sort of research concerning his stay in Cuba. The charges of dictatorship are, of course, totally unfounded. How can you possibly describe as a dictator an individual who has been voted for by his constituents? We say, for example, we're talking about Raúl Castro, who was just like Fidel before him, is referred to as a dictator by many Western media. He was voted for, first of all, by his constituents, and then after that he was voted president of the National Assembly by the elected members of that assembly, and then he was finally validated then by the Council of State. So he's 3 times voted for. Can we say the same thing about some of our own leaders? In order to understand why the Cuban people vote massively in all elections and referenda, the scale of such a participation seldom, I don't think, has ever fallen below 95%. I think one has to understand the nature of Cuban civil society that has been developed democratically since 1959, since the revolution. Instead of such a political kind of parties that are in fact a, if you like, the result of a class-divided society and conflicting interests in such a society, in Cuba, which is consecrated, if you like, to the ideal of equality, instead of such a political kind of parties, we have a plethora of civil organizations. Maybe the nearest thing that we have to it here is a trade union. In other words, people belong to organizations that have to do with the kind of work they do normally. But then there can be organizations also apart from that, such as churches. Right. So every Cuban, almost every Cuban voter belongs to an organization, and he participates actively in the affairs of that organization. That organization is the one that will select candidates. In other words, he will vote for candidates who will ultimately stand for election. Now, sorry? Okay. So this, in fact, is rather unlike our system here, where we are presented with lists of kind of candidates by parties. It's the people themselves that select the candidates. And they don't select them on the basis of membership of the Communist Party. They select them on the basis of their perceived, if you like, social worthiness. Having selected their candidates, then the electoral sort of process itself starts. Now, recall that we're talking about 3 levels. We're talking about local elections, provincial elections, and national elections. In the case of local elections, it's the residents' associations that vote in order to select candidates. And the candidates haven't been selected then. After that, it's a direct secret ballot in order to elect representatives. So representatives are elected in a somewhat similar way by other organizations when we're talking about the provincial level and the national level. In other words, the civic organizations, for example, the Federation of Cuban Women, the various organizations that have to do with trades and professions, such as jurists, such as workers, such as students, health workers, etc. All of these have their organizations. And these organizations, in a democratic way, select candidates. And these candidates are then voted for, once again, in a direct and secret ballot. The electoral sort of process itself is open to scrutiny, not only by Cubans, but also by outsiders, by people from outside who are interested in verifying that this is indeed a highly democratic and according to the criteria that are used generally in the West, a highly democratic process. So that is the electoral kind of process. The voting, incidentally, the ordinary Cuban, and once again visitors, can examine the scrutiny of the votes. They can examine the counting. And once the kind of count has been made, they can then examine the ballots, even the white ballots, the people who have not voted for any candidate. They can examine these. Ordinary Cubans can do this, and visitors can do this to verify for themselves that the process is totally above board. That having happened, we then have the three levels: the local government, provincial government, and national government. To start with, national government, I suppose, is the nearest thing that we have to a Dáil here. There are 601 representatives. It meets 3 times a year, and it will deliberate on the various issues that national kind of governments do deliberate on, such as health, the economy, security, internal affairs, external affairs, and so forth. They will debate, make decisions, take votes, pass legislation. The government then itself will appoint attorney generals, and in fact more or less the functions that one has of that one encounters in Western governments. Normal sort of democratic, we say that the procedures at that level are carried out. Maybe there's one other thing that should be mentioned here, which is that the elected representatives receive no pay whatsoever. They will receive pay if they have to work at their representative work on a full-time basis, but their pay is limited to what they earned before they were elected. In other words, a doctor will get a doctor's pay, a shoe repairer will get a shoe repairer's pay, etc. That is one thing that must be mentioned here. Something else that should be mentioned is that in the campaign, in the electoral kind of campaign itself, this is more or less a non-starter. There isn't a campaign as such. Voters are simply given a photograph of the would-be representatives, the kind of candidates. He's given a photograph and a brief sort of biography, itemizing their activities, especially their sort of social activities. So therefore, it isn't sort of possible for a candidate with a sum of money or something to buy votes or to run a slick sort of campaign through the media. No, he stands on his own merits as perceived by the people who are going to vote.